Hi everyone, I'm Dr.Animaction. Welcome to the first of the exploratory companion videos for my Doctor's Deep Dive series. Well, I'll be continuing that and using it to look at the history, production, and behind-the-scenes anecdotes of various shows. In these videos, I'll simply be looking at the stories, characters, settings, and technology from each like the giant nerd I am. And as much as I hope you find the deep dives informative and interesting, I hope that you find these just plain fun. I guess before you can form an opinion on that, though, you actually need to watch a video. So let's start getting caught up with the deep dives, the challenge of the GoBots. GoBots was one of several shape-shifting giant robot cartoons to hit our airways in the 80s, having been adapted from the Japanese toy line Machine Robo. The adaptation fleshed out the backstory, though, literally, by telling an origin for the GoBots that had them start out as biological humanoids. The world Gobotron was deep in the midst of a civil war between factions called the Guardians and the Renegades, when the Renegades accidentally caused a cataclysm by pulling an asteroid straight into the planet. With Gobotron nearly uninhabitable and its inhabitants on the verge of extinction, a hero stepped forward in the form of a man known simply as the Last Engineer. He had been experimenting with replacing body parts with cybernetic substitutes, and used the knowledge he'd gained from those experiments to transfer the minds of several surviving Gobotronians, or I guess the show calls them Go-beings, into powerful mechanical bodies. I'm not sure why he did that for both the Guardians and Renegades, but he did, and then sealed himself away in suspended animation while the factions picked up the war right where they'd left off. If you hear me say the same thing again later, it's because I decided to use the same script for the robotics deep dive at some point in the future. Anyway, the newly christened GoBots were also exposed to a machine called a modifier, which gave them the amazing power to change into vehicles from a planet none of them had ever heard of, which was a power that served them no purpose in the war since they could all fly and shoot lasers in their normal robot forms anyway. Regardless, the Guardians began to get the upper hand in the war, so the Renegade's leader and a pair of his lieutenants set out for Earth, which they know about and have already contacted someone on to establish a new base to continue the war from, somehow, or some reason. This plan and the reasoning behind it for Earth's involvement is never really explained, but a trio of Guardians set off in pursuit, and the Civil War comes here.
Now, back to the challenge of the GoBots.
Every single cartoon from the 80s and 90s is either elevated or destroyed by its characters and technology. I mean, those are what we got for toys after all, so their on-screen representations needed to engage our imaginations. For the GoBots, the core cast was distilled down to a handful of characters from the rather extensive full lineup of 42. These primary characters were a mix of 4 good guy Guardians and a trio each of the bad guy Renegades and human sidekicks, with several other characters making supporting appearances when the story demanded it. Let's get the humans out of the way first, as they're the most boring of the characters and really only there to give us a connection to the big sci-fi robots. These consisted of 3 astronauts named Matt Hunter, Nick Burns, and Allison Jen Moria, or AJ, Foster. That really never made much sense to me though, as even if Matt looks like a man in his 30s or 40s, Nick and AJ look a lot more like teenagers. I could maybe even buy them as 20-somethings, but in any case they're not old enough to have become actual astronauts. I mean, in their first appearance, Nick couldn't even recognize Australia from space. But astronauts they were, and as a side note, their ship looks a lot like the G.I. Joe Crusader that would be released years later. They even work for some government agency called Space Corps, apparently a military one as they report to a general. Oh my bad, I guess it's actually part of NASA. Whatever the case, they cross paths with the Renegades as they approach Earth, almost literally, since their ship is nearly rammed, which is the most convenient convenience in the history of convenience, since space is a really big, space, and the chances of 2 specks intersecting is pretty much infinitesimal. They fly down to investigate the ship in the least aerodynamic vehicle ever, only to get shot down by the Renegades and subsequently rescued by the Guardians. There's also an evil for evil's sake scientist from the same organization named Dr. Braxis with a personal grudge against the astronauts, who teams up with the Renegades as a scheming story device throughout the series. Braxis was apparently also the human the Renegades had already contacted, and because of his generic hunger for power, he betrayed the rest of humanity. Somehow. He doesn't really do much other than give the Renegades access to a military facility with a satellite dish. We honestly don't ever get any official status for the humans after that point though, as they just kind of hang out with the Guardians as story devices for the rest of the series. But the human analogs stick around in every episode regardless of whether or not they have any real impact. Moving on though, let's shift focus from the humans to the star attractions, the GoBots. The Guardians, who serve as the show's main characters, consist of the valiant leader, conveniently named Leader 1, his gruff veteran Lieutenant Turbo, and the sensitive, nervous young fighter Scooter, eventually expanding that roster to a main 4 with the addition of a young female Guardian named Smallfoot. The Guardian characters definitely follow the archetypes of the time, though. or maybe since they came out in 1984 helped establish them, with the textbook heroic leader, the kill-em-all soldier who charges into battle and usually gets messed up, the one with the hidden reserves of bravery that overcomes his fears to save everyone, and the brash young warrior with something to prove. Other than that, the only things that differentiate them from each other, since all GoBots have the same core power set, was Leader 1's ability to project a force field that always eventually failed, and Scooter's ability to project holograms. There really wasn't anything else to set them apart, except for their vehicle forms. Anyway, let's move on to the Renegades, led by the evil Psykill with the support of his sycophantic lieutenants Coptor and Crasher. Again, we had some archetypes going on here, with Psykill being the power-hungry megalomaniac, Coptor the cold and ruthless loyal one, and Crasher the crazed, reckless destroyer. Just like with the Guardians, there wasn't much to differentiate the Renegades based on abilities, other than Coptor's whirling rotor blade sword thing and Crasher's earthquake stomp, which oddly enough worked just fine on the metallic ground of Gobotron the same way it did on the dirt and rock ground of Earth. Let's take a second and talk about them not as characters though, but as technology, since one of the chief complaints about GoBots was the simplicity of their... Am I allowed to use the word transformations here? Whatever, I'm going to anyway. Most of the GoBot action figures took 3 to 5 steps to convert from robot to vehicle, and that simplicity kind of limited the character designs for the series. Characters like Scooter and Crasher, for example, didn't even really have heads, instead just projecting faces via a screen or something. Plus, the characters came across as stiff-jointed in motion as well, with articulation in the cartoon limited to where it could reasonably be expected given the mostly boxy designs. Except for Psykill, that is, with his tubular noodle arms. The real issues, though, were in the vehicle forms, since more often than not, these did little to disguise the characters' robotic natures. This is especially true for characters like Coptor and Psykill, whose faces were readily apparent in vehicle form as well. But there are other issues to talk about too, like Scooter's face moving to where his abdomen is as a robot when he's in vehicle form, or the fact that Leader 1 has 4 very prominent non-retractable landing gear in his jet form. One of the potentially biggest issues with vehicle forms was one of scale, no pun intended, as Scooter could be 3 times the height of a human and comparable to the other Guardians in robot form, but typically Scooter-sized as a vehicle, whereas Psykill was larger than the other Renegades and seemed to maintain that scale as a motorcycle. I'm trying to keep comparisons to Transformers out of this video, but at least that series showed us some of them had magic size-changing powers, and didn't let the design of the cartoon characters be limited by the limitations of the toys.
Now, back to the challenge of the GoBots.
Anywho, let's move on and talk about the settings. This show primarily took place in one of 3 distinct settings, consisting of Earth, space, and Gobotron, but several episodes moved the action to various other planets to facilitate a story. The Earth in the show is pretty much contemporary 80s, but as with a lot of series from that time, the settings were mostly just backdrops. This was especially bad with GoBots though, as the planet seemed to only be populated with villains or background characters. There were no just people. The government of the series obviously knew about the Guardians and the Renegades, but if that were the case, you'd think they'd be more involved in the conflict. Instead, we get our 3 human representatives as the only sort of official or semi-official interactions throughout. It makes the world feel a lot less real, especially looking back at the series through adult eyes. As for the parts that took place on Gobotron, they didn't really emphasize the sci-fi robot world either, with it just being a place where the action happened. Add to that the ease with which the characters moved between the two, and the setting became pretty incidental to any of the stories. In most other shows of the era, the setting would often be used to introduce some environmental obstacles or conditions that elevated the stakes of the story happening within them, but you never really felt that with any place the stories in GoBots took place. Even in the episodes involving alien worlds or time travel, the plot was rarely impacted, and we just got the latest race for a MacGuffin or mysterious power with a different coat of paint. Sure, setting isn't the most important element in a lot of action cartoons, but it was barely an element of the GoBots at all.
Now, back to the challenge of the GoBots.
As with all of its contemporaries, GoBots was filled with fantastical technology and machinery. The series had everything from weather manipulators to planetary nets to teleportation beams and everything in between. So far, so action cartoon. However, the series did have a couple of pieces of unique tech to set it apart, specifically the power suits and the ships. We'll talk about the power suits first, since those honestly weren't terribly impressive. They were essentially a little more than wearable phone booths that made their occupants' lasers more powerful. That was kind of a trade-off though, as it also made them significantly less maneuverable and dexterous, and took away their ability to change forms. They really didn't add anything to the mythology of the series, and were honestly little more than a toy gimmick that the show had to adopt. The toys themselves, which were the same thing for both sides, just in different color schemes, weren't terribly impressive either. I got both versions for Christmas one year and was a little put off by the fact that each power suit had a list of specific characters that could wear them, and because I didn't have one of the characters in a couple of instances, I had some suits that were forever empty. Plus, the ones that did have characters in them would usually see the figure fall out in combiner mode, at least the arms. Oh, and the combiner itself was only articulated at the shoulders. You could maybe consider the hips articulated too, but not really. The last two notable pieces of technology in the series, though, were its saving grace, as both the Guardian's Command Center and the Renegade Thruster ships were pretty cool designs. I was especially a fan of the Command Center, as it looked nice and sleek and had a pretty great color scheme with the gray and deep crimson red, and had the pretty cool alternate walker form as well. Yeah, it looked goofy whenever it actually did walk on the cartoon, but it was cool just standing there. As for Thruster, it was just a basic ship, but it was a pretty good looking one. Fortunately, the cartoon only made the mistake of putting them in their, robot forms once, and didn't bother acknowledging the capability ever again. Those forms were fine as play features on the toys, but they didn't really have any place in the show. Still, the overall designs get a thumbs up from me.
Now, back to the challenge of the GoBots.
So there you go, a look into GoBots from a story and design perspective. I know I criticized the series quite a bit here, and I stand behind everything I said, but one important thing to understand is that I truly enjoy the show, even with everything I said going on. At the end of the day, characters and gear and such draw me in, but the fun factor is all I really need to keep me engaged, and the series was campy, cheesy fun. If I were to give it a score from 1 to 10 using my personal favorite and least favorite cartoons as a bookend of that scale, Challenge of the GoBots would get something around a solid 6. Sure, it's got its flaws, but there's a lot here to enjoy, especially if you have the benefit of nostalgia for the series. But I hope you had some fun with this video and its format as a companion to the behind-the-scenes deep dives, as I plan on doing them for the other series I've already covered to get caught up. Let me know in the comments what parts of the video you liked and what parts you didn't for me to consider for future episodes. I'm also working on the next animated 90s video, so hopefully that one will be up in the next couple days, as well as another one or two from some of my smaller series. Thanks for watching, everyone. Stay tuned and stay tuned, as in cartoons. Later.